Consider supporting Archaeo-Soup on Patreon for as little as $1 per month. Link available in the video description.
Hello, Rebecca Wragg Sykes. Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to have you here. And in particular, it's a pleasure to have someone who I can sort of nail down a little bit about the Neanderthals.
They are tricky.
They are tricky. They are tricky. And first of all, actually, can you just introduce yourself, what you're affiliated with, and what you do, as it were?
Yeah, I'm an honorary fellow at the University of Liverpool and also at the University of Bordeaux, where I did my postdoc. So I was in academia for a while, and I've kind of sagged slightly out, but staying slightly in. And yes, so I have my first book is out. It was out in August, so
Which is very exciting. Kindred, Neanderthal life, love, death, and art, and it's precisely this sort of thing that I wanted to get someone on to talk about, because I was explaining to you off camera, and I've explained to people at home several times over the years, that there are two topics I tend to skirt on this channel. Topic number one: Stonehenge. The moment you say anything current about Stonehenge, there's a new theory the following week or the following month, or for example, a whole new 1.5 mile wide monument has been discovered, for example,
yeah.
recently. So that's really hard to be definitive about. And the second one is Neanderthals, and I'll just briefly explain why, because you may be able to relate to this, in so much as for me, Neanderthals have always been brimming with potential. And it's always felt a little bit as though you are sort of forced in conventional conversations to decide, are they or were they brutal, knuckle-dragging simpletons, or were they essentially like us, but somehow also dramatic evolutionary failures? And that kind of conversation, it's really hard to have and to justify, and to have current, because there's so much being done, so much research being done on Neanderthals at any
Damn
given time.
archaeology, always finding new stuff.
New stuff, new things about the past. Can't we just put it in a book and be done? So, so I guess first and foremost, I suppose, for you, why Neanderthals? What drew you to them?
I kind of, I don't know, I came sort of to the conclusion that it would be Neanderthals I was really going for, only probably during my master's, actually, at Southampton Centre of Archaeology of Human Origins. That's a fantastic place. But I knew before that I was really interested in the Paleolithic and, Ice Age, Pleistocene worlds. And as I do sort of give a shout out in the book, that is partly down to reading Jean Auel at a formative age, as many other archaeologists will admit.
It seems to be the way, doesn't it?
But actually, aside from the story, I loved the detail that she went into in describing the Pleistocene world, all of the animals and the plants, but also much more about her, considering when she first wrote those books, and she began them in the 80s, or was it 79? I can't even remember. It was a long time ago. And the depth of detail that she manages, considering that sort of our evidence for things like plant use was pretty minimal back then. It's held up to some extent. She really created this idea of what a Pleistocene hunter-gatherer life way could be, and all the different sort of technologies and the skills that would be involved in that. And that is what really sort of blew me away. It did take me a long time to understand what a striking platform was from her descriptions of flint knapping. I couldn't get my head around that. But then I did lithics. I did training in lithic technology and analysis for all my masters. So suddenly it made sense. But I don't know. I liked the other thing about her books, I guess it's the first two of her books I like, The Clan of the Cave Bear and The Valley of Horses, which are the ones that have the most Neanderthal stuff in. And I think what's really striking about those is that the Neanderthals are not sort of clones. You know, they're very different in character. They're different in their skills. And I think that sort of is a thread of interest that's been there for me for a long time. Is, you know, what was the reality of lived existence like? I mean, archaeology, you know, you can kind of go for a positivist view of archaeology and sort of, well, but what can we prove? And I did take that perspective for a long time. And then I did a PhD at Sheffield and was introduced to later prehistorians who sort of are quite happy to go, you know, slightly more
What's
interpretive
possible?
and,
Yeah.
you know, yeah, exactly. What's potentially possible? What is an inference that we can make that is, you know, not too off the wall? And I sort of started to think, well, you know, why can't we do that? And other people before, you know, other people's work who had sort of begun to do that, like for example Clive Gamble with the Paleolithic Societies of Europe. That book was written a long time ago, still excellent book, and to some extent he does try and do that. He brings together many threads in that book. He tacks between different kinds of evidence to build up a picture, and I think that's what excites me about the Paleolithic. You know, sometimes I wish we had more material sources, you know, a bit more organics would always be nice. But at the same time, it's the challenge of dealing with that paucity of material evidence when you compare it to the rest of archaeology. But in fact, actually, the amount of stuff we have now about Neanderthals is gigantic. And that's what I wanted to do with the book, to kind of just bring all that together, that people may, you know, people know that the Neanderthals are exciting and they're in the headlines a lot, but it's the sort of the minute, crazy details of the archaeology that we do now that people don't always know about. And those, you know, when you bring all that together, the picture of Neanderthal life that we can produce now is quite amazing.
Okay. And in that sense, it's interesting because I think, having just heard you describe how you've described this approach to Neanderthals, my memories of studying, in particular, well, it's funny because I converted from Arch to Arc in uni, so I started off with quite a grounding in human evolution in the first year, and then moved away from anthropology technically. But well, anyway, we all know it's complicated. Depends where you study, so on and so forth. But anyway, the point is, when I moved into the second year, and people were talking about Mousterian lithic technologies, and there was lots of conversations about breakages on bones that we see in Neanderthal skeletons, and it felt, compared to how you've just been talking about it, it felt a little bit as though what the goal was trying to reconstruct almost if we can just get hold of one Neanderthal, you know, if we can just reconstruct one, and so you end up with this being, and often I think imagined normally as a juvenile male, unfortunately, this being who is simultaneously a rodeo rider, a spear thrower, potentially into art, possibly either a slave or taking slaves from Homo sapiens, and also as well a sort of, to use an old antiquarian, I suppose, notion, a noble savage potentially, but also one who we don't want to be too human. So maybe someone who doesn't quite have language, and so there's a lot of pressure to put on to one imagined individual. And so, as you say, it's probably better to spread it out a little bit and to think about it different. But how then would you encourage people to come to Neanderthals, and what sort of, I mean, what sort of tidbits or what sort of flavors do you think should be thrown into that pot?
Well, I think one of the things that I hope people would take away from this book is that while we do talk about the Neanderthals, they were not like a monolithic entity.
No.
You know, the span of time that they existed for, somewhere between 400, maybe 350,000 years ago, they emerge and they disappear from the fossil record, although not in genetic terms, they're still here. But they disappear in terms of seeing their bones and everything around 40,000 years. So that's a huge span of time. It covers massive change in terms of climate cycles, multiple phases of glacials and interglacials, the warm phases. We're in one now. But also the geographic range that they existed across was massive. We tend to sort of pigeonhole them as European creatures, but a lot of the archaeology is there, and they may well have emerged in that setting, although we don't know. But actually, if you look at just the square mileage of where we know their sites were, they are more Asian than European. So they are West Eurasians, really, as far as we can tell. So I think that's one thing that we should expect diversity from the Neanderthals. We shouldn't expect it to all look the same. And equally, all of that range in space and time means that we have to think of them from the outset as adaptable and flexible. So this sort of notion that people have had presented for a long time, that's been in textbooks, this idea that Neanderthals sort of emerged, invented prepared core technology or Levallois as their sort of flagship technology, and then didn't do anything else. That's totally false. There is so much more variety and richness in how we understand what they were doing in different places at different times, and even creativity. So I think that's definitely one thing that I think I would hope people take away. But also, as you said, the question, that I kind of address it towards the end of the book, after kind of giving everyone all the cool archaeology, I then sort of say, well, the Neanderthals are in a sense also being created by us constantly, because they're not only a reality in archaeological terms, but they are a cultural phenomenon. They were the first hominins that we sort of rediscovered in the 19th century, and they have stood for the other for so long, and we still do that. We have them as a foil to us. The questions that we want to ask change, but we still have a tendency to position them in opposition to what we think we are. And our desires for our identity, our fears, we project those, and so although the archaeology changes and there is a feedback cycle between what we find and then how we imagine them, and then how we imagine them also colours what we're looking for in the record, there's definitely sort of an issue of us being ready to see things about the Neanderthals. That is a very interesting question, and what people in the 19th century were willing to conceptualize, or even capable of conceptualizing, is obviously very different to today.
Yeah, well, and hopefully what I was learning had moved on somewhat from the 19th century, but it's interesting how, as you say, that question has always been at the heart of our approach to Neanderthals. And I mean, in the past, I've sort of had a thought that in some ways Neanderthals are kind of very similar to sci-fi in terms of how we approach other and humanity. And there's a reason that the Terminator scares the crap out of us, because it's almost us, but it's also not us. And I suppose in that sense, then, how would you like people to consider Neanderthals on that sort of spectrum? Should we be conceiving them as sort of cousins, almost like us, but also not quite, or should we not even try and go there? I'm sort of two minds about that myself to a certain extent.
Well, I am. I mean, it's impossible not to, because as humans, our mindset, actually, we are very much open to connection. We want to connect. That is what archaeology is actually all about. People want to connect with the past, and the Neanderthals were always potentially part of that. And now we know for sure that they were directly ancestral, at least at some points in time through interbreeding phases to us. I think once that was known, it's only a decade ago that we've had that first evidence from the nuclear genomes that confirmed there was interbreeding. But I think that shifted public view about Neanderthals. People had always been interested in them, but I think people started to feel something deeper at that point.
Well, Eddie Izzard did a thing, didn't he? He went round studying this, and he was, oh, I'm part Neanderthal, and well, what was interesting there though was that it then became almost chic, didn't it, in some spaces to be
People,
Neanderthal.
were for different reasons.
Mm,
People are keen to know what percentage Neanderthal they are. That's an interesting phenomenon. But I mean, even for archaeologists, I think some might say, "Oh, well, we weren't surprised that there was interbreeding. We always said there was." But I think the majority models that were accepted was the out of Africa model that said early Homo sapiens, so us, began to disperse from Africa relatively late and replace the Neanderthals with no, real interaction, certainly no interbreeding. So for for people who were sort of happy with that theory, the interbreeding, I think, was something of a, okay, we need to change some of our ideas here. So it was, it had impact in the archaeological world and in the public. But in terms of how we frame them, I find it changes all the time, and as it should. If we are scientists, we deal with data, we have ideas. If new data appears, then yeah, we should change our ideas. So, I mean, I think for me, writing this book involved, I mean, as I said, technically my specialism is lithic archaeology, stone tools, and understanding that side of Neanderthals. That's what my PhD was and all that. But to write this book, I kind of had to, go big scale and look at all of what we know about Neanderthals and really get into the depth of that, and then take out the good stuff, like distill it all. And having done that,
a synthesis.
Yes. Sort of, yes, a finely distilled vintage. I don't know, but I still don't know where I stand in some ways.
No.
I think it very much depends on what aspect of their lives you're looking at, and also at what point in time you're choosing to compare them with us, because clearly, 21st century globalized world looks nothing like Neanderthals, but there are plenty of indigenous hunter-gatherer groups, communities, cultures around the world who are living, it's very difficult when you say, you don't want to say they are living Stone Age lives, because that's not true, and offensive, and it's offensive. But what I'm saying is that life way is perfectly right and correct, and that is successful in that environment that those people are in. That's all they need. That's fine. That makes total sense. And so Neanderthals were just as successful as recent hunter-gatherers in that world that they're in. So, the question of, would Neanderthals ever have come up with cities? I don't really know, but, cities are not what defines Homo sapiens necessarily.
No.
It defines one way of being Homo sapiens. So, if you then go back into the Paleolithic, even if you're talking about Paleolithic Homo sapiens, where you need to say, well, at what point are we trying to compare? Are we trying to compare later Upper Paleolithic people, people who were making, creating Lascaux, or are we talking about earlier Upper Paleolithic people who made Chauvet, like 15,000 years before Lascaux, rather? Or are we comparing it with early Homo sapiens cultures in southern Africa 80,000 years ago? They're all, different ways of being Homo sapiens, and depending on which one you're choosing, the level of comparability will change. And it's not just about the preservation of different kinds of evidence. It's about what people are doing in different times and places, and none of those things are necessarily better or cleverer than anything else. If we're willing to say that, early Homo sapiens in Africa who were interested in pigments, so the southern African sites like Blombos, or Diepkloof, where you have ostrich eggshells with quite graphically constrained designs scratched on them. We don't see that in Neanderthal groups, but equally Neanderthals are doing a lot more with the bodies of the dead than
Mm.
those communities appear to have been doing. And it's like, well, if the Neanderthals had a mortuary archaeological record as poor as what we see in southern Africa, we would hold that against them.
Yeah.
Um,
But we didn't hold it against ourselves. No.
yeah, exactly. So
Yeah.
I think
Mm.
certainly there are things that we see in early Homo sapiens communities from 100,000 years through to 40,000 years that they were doing that Neanderthals didn't do. And we never so far have found that in Neanderthal archaeology. But in other ways, like the general sort of impression of their hunting ability, the kind of organization of across landscape scales or within sites, is very comparable. So I think that's sort of the mystery and the excitement of Neanderthals, is that, you know, there are these contradictions in what they seem to be doing, but is that a question of capacity or just simply not needing to do those things? And a really good example of that is blade technology. For a very long time, that was one of sort of the little tick lists of supposedly modern behaviour. Neanderthals didn't really do blades, but as people paid more attention to the archaeological record, it became clear that actually Neanderthals could make blades.
Yeah.
They can even make little bladelets, but it just seems that they didn't really want to. It was not part of what was interesting them. So that is in a more subtle way of looking at it, I think. There is something to do with cognitive capacity, but actually grasping what that is hard, and then you get more and more evidence coming and it changes the picture.
It's interesting. I remember one of my earliest exposures to the idea, into higher education, to the idea of human evolution, was when someone, he was a very bombastic lecturer, he came into the room and sort of said, "You, hello, yes, hello, you, can you dive to 3 miles under the ocean and hold your breath for 20 minutes? No. You, can you eat soil, you know, and poop out something that's useful for farming? No. You know, you, can you, and essentially what he was demonstrating was the fact that this notion of comparing different creatures based on their particular special set of skills, whales and earthworms in those cases, for example, isn't necessarily fair. You know, it's not fair to say, well, you're rubbish then if you can't do what a whale can do, or if you can't do what a worm can do. What does a worm do? Sorry, just
Yeah.
yeah. But it's so in that sense, yeah, maybe it isn't fair to do some of these comparisons, but also they are somewhat irresistible. I mean, for
Oh, yeah.
questions such as, for example, language, and yet I remember uh, reading a very interesting notion. I mean, for example, when you look at things like, you know, ideas like the cathedral mind, things like language, you don't necessarily have to have the same rounded and series of sounds that we do, or what we might consider to be a complete set of sounds, in order to have language. You can make clicks, you can do humming. There's all sorts of different ways of communicating that don't require what we value. Um, and so not because I don't want us to go back into precisely more or less the same topic again. I suppose what I would ask, therefore, is how would you describe Neanderthals to someone? What should people be imagining when they think of Neanderthals?
I guess I would say they are another pathway in being a kind of human. In evolutionary timescales, they only separated off from us very recently, and that is why we can interbreed with them. And produce hybrid children who clearly had their own children. You know, they were fertile. It's more that I mean, there are differences certainly in culture, and also, I mean, physically, they, despite what appears to be quite a long history now of phases of contact with interbreeding, going back probably before 250,000 years ago, it now looks like. Yet we and they maintained our morphological differences. Our bodies didn't merge. We didn't assimilate each other. And presumably, if that's the case with anatomy, then the same thing is with culture. You know, there may have been some kind of sort of legacies culturally as well as genetic, but it's very, very difficult to see that. But in terms of the separate sort of trajectories, I think they did largely, there does appear to be a separation. So we were on different pathways, I think. But you know, clearly Neanderthals were just as evolved as we were, and they only disappeared a blink ago in geological terms. So I think, for me, I would say, if you place Neanderthals in the grand chronological scheme of human evolution compared to the Australopithecines, you know, 3 million years ago plus, and 3.3 million years is now the earliest archaeology we find, the earliest clear evidence of stone tool working. It's you know, it's just hitting on anvils, but it's there. That's so old, you know. And for the Neanderthals to have appeared, they're very close to where we are, you know. So given that chronological recency, I would say we should expect to be more similar to each other than different, purely from that point of view. And at the same time, you know, we having only one sort of hominin still in existence, us, we're forced to look for living parallels to our closest relatives, which is primates, chimpanzees and bonobos. And the amount of similarity between us and them is so striking that you kind of think, well, it's very likely Neanderthals shared a lot of those very basic traits in terms of sociability, emotions, complexity in communication, not in language, obviously, because chimpanzees do not use language, but all the other complex ways that they do communicate, the richness of their society and the tool use, all of that. If we're happy to accept that in primates who, yes, they have been on their own evolutionary pathway as well, but I think we should be expecting Neanderthals to at least share many of the complex emotional sort of capacities we see in those other primates, which are the things that I think sometimes we're scared to allow Neanderthals, you know, like we know chimpanzees laugh. They don't sound like us when they laugh. They kind of they sort of cough, but they chill out. They tickle each other. They laugh. They play jokes on each other. The idea of Neanderthals doing that seems a bit like, oh, really? Can we let them do that? But of course they had to do that. We don't know what their jokes were about, but
probably
you know,
poop, just like the rest of us.
Oh, I pushed him over, whatever. But yeah, so I think that's what's so difficult, that if you take it from a cold, hard evolutionary perspective, then Neanderthals must be vastly more similar to us than to, you know, other members of the hominin family tree going back, because they only separated recently. But sort of proving that archaeologically is difficult, and there are these differences that do appear to be genuine, and that will be, you know, used as potential reasons to then explain why our later history happened, basically. So I guess I would say that they're another kind of human, and that we should expect the unexpected with them, but we should also not expect them to necessarily be vastly less than us, you know.
Well, and I suppose there's an interesting quandary there, isn't there? In so much of the temptation is to presume, therefore, that they would essentially want to become us, which is, like, I think, is also one of the underlying problems with this notion of, as you say, what do we allow them to be, or why it is that we sort of fear them in that sense. Is this notion of their trajectory either being the same or even different to ours is equally unnerving to some people.
Well, and also there's the fact that we like to assume that we are the success story, and you know, that they failed because, you know, there's no Neanderthals walking around the world today, although technically they didn't fail because they are in most living people today. Their genetic material still exists, so they are not extinct in that sense. But yeah, I mean, arguably, how successful are we if we have gone beyond the carrying capacity of the entire Earth, essentially. So I think, yeah, that's the question here. Like, on what basis are we defining ourselves is the question before we start to discuss them.
Yeah. Do you think that that people would spot a Neanderthal in a crowd? And this is something which often comes up, I
Yes,
think. But do you think it would
I
be
think
easily
so.
easily to spot? Sorry, go on.
I think so, yeah.
Mm,
I mean, what we, maybe in a crowded place, not, but if you stood face to face with a Neanderthal, yes, I think they would look strikingly different. And we can see from lots of very recent, really nice analysis that even from birth, a little Neanderthal baby in your arms would look a little bit different. They didn't have a little chin. The head is longer. The front of their face is already starting to be more pulled forwards. So they would look a bit different. But at the same time, developmentally, they seem to have followed roughly a very similar growth trajectory to ours. So a Neanderthal baby, a 6-week-old, is probably going to be hitting that same milestone that our babies do when they start to light up and really look around and start smiling at you. So you would expect sort of that cognitive and physical development to be the same in the early years, certainly. But overall, their physical sort of differences would be clear, I think, from an early age, and they got more obvious as they got older as well. They grew into it. You can see like gangly teenage Neanderthals, beginning to sort of get their full features, and yeah, although on average they are shorter than us, I think if you met a Neanderthal, you'd have been like, "Whew, yeah,
yeah.
this is
Well,
someone."
I mean, I think I once read somewhere that and again, it's one of those weird things where we're taking individuals and we're mapping them onto entire species in that sense. But this idea of there being very strong musculature. Someone said, that it may be hyperbole, but like a teenage Neanderthal may well have the similar arms to Rafael Nadal, this kind of thing. And
Well, yeah, they were
mm,
robust, and already we can see in adolescence that not only are the bones more robust, but certainly the muscle attachments are big, and the impression is that even from a young age, they were very physically active. They were engaging in full-on living. The question of what is childhood is very different across all cultures today, and in many traditional societies, children do very physical work very early. They will hunter-gatherer kids will walk around with knives, and it's part of just normality. And I think that's something that we see with Neanderthals, that they are certainly beginning to be just as physically robust as hench as the adults quite early on.
yeah. What else then? Because so in the title of your book, then this notion of kindred is interesting.
Kindred is in like literal family,
Okay.
on the large scale of things. They are our closest relatives,
Yeah.
or they were, in terms of chronology, and the fact that potentially somewhere between 20 to even up to half of their genome may still be around, spread between different living populations. But they are the closest to us in that sense. And we're only just sort of really beginning to unpick the extent of the interbreeding, and it now seems from super recent research that the Neanderthals Y chromosome was ours, and it was taken through very early interbreeding, pre 200,000, and replaced theirs. So the later interbreeding that's happening 50,000 years ago is with Neanderthals who have Homo sapiens Y chromosome. So it's like,
Wow.
there's so many different connections at different levels, and I think that's the idea. I wanted to just convey the fact that they are our relations, basically. at many different levels. It's that idea of relationality, really.
Okay, and that's why I didn't want to just presume what it meant. I was trying to draw that out a little bit. But in that sense, then, what else within that weaving interconnectability should we expect to, or should we not be surprised by when it comes to Neanderthals? So, for example, I guess the biggies would be language, art, and music. You know,
Yeah.
where do you stand on that, or where do you think people should expect Neanderthals to be on those those spectrums?
I think those are the three, big things that people want to know about Neanderthals. I can talk about hunting and the stone tool technology and stuff, but actually those are things people want to know. But I think the shift in what we see has been quite gradual. But at the same time, there are some sort of wow finds that have, really blown people away. In terms of sort of evidence for art, I don't really like using that word, although it's in my title. that was the publishers, but yeah.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, I like to use the word aesthetics more,
Yes.
and I do sort of define exactly what I mean about that in the book, and it's more to do with the fact that if you come from a Western cultural context, then art tends to be something you think of as a visual medium that is finished, and you go to a gallery and you look at it, you stick it on your wall. That's one way of understanding art, but it can be much more about an experiential, creative process, and art can be something that is meaningful in the moment of its production and less so afterwards. If we look at sort of what chimpanzees do, actually, they're quite keen on when you give them the tools to make paintings and stuff. They're quite into that. They like it. They don't really care about it once they've done it.
No.
Quite often. They like the production. It's really interesting, and they're really in the zone. But they don't then go and put it somewhere to admire it later. So I think we need to be careful about what we are assuming is meaningful behavior in the first place before we even then say, well, can we see something in the archaeological record? So I think that's one question. And then also, it's a little bit like the issue with mortuary behavior, dealing with the dead. What we are sort of the levels of proof that we hold Neanderthals to are somewhat different to what we will allow early Homo sapiens archaeology to be. If you find a fossil shell with red pigment on it in a Homo sapiens site, you'll be like, oh yeah, something symbolic and cool and exciting there.
Pigmentation.
With Neanderthals, people are a bit more conservative, which fair enough, that's okay. But when you actually look at the totality of the evidence for interest in pigment, interest in objects which have no clear functional explanation, there's a definite trend, I think, that's emerged over the past 3 decades for there being some kind of aesthetic sense in Neanderthals. They're interested in things, and it makes complete sense. They have the same color vision. They're attracted to, I would think that they're attracted, just as chimpanzees are and we are, to bright colors, to lustrous surfaces, to mark making. And again, I do discuss chimpanzee oeuvre, the art oeuvre, in the book, because it's very interesting that there are some parallels. That they like to sort of produce marks and colours within defined spaces and things like this. So there are some.
So there'll be sort of overlaps of marks, or additional, sort of almost.
It depends on the individual chimpanzee as well, because they have their own styles. And sometimes they'll do lots of lines coming from one source. It's like a fan shape. We see that in the early Homo sapiens record in Africa, and occasionally on some objects made by Neanderthals where they are incised, and it's nothing to do with butchery. So there's sort of vague similarities there that perhaps are to do with an ancient bodily aesthetic interest in engaging with materials, which would just make sense. Chimpanzees are curious, they have bodies, there is a very basic pleasure in engaging with materials. So I think we shouldn't be surprised that we see that in Neanderthals. The question then is, if you do find things like a fossil shell that's been sourced 100 kilometers from a site with red pigment on, sourced 40 kilometers away, what does that mean? And we do have that. That's from an Italian site called Grotta Fumane, about 50,000 years ago, Neanderthals 55. So what does that actually mean? And that's where the difficulty comes in. And I think what I've tried to do in the book, and what I think archaeologists have been building up a case over the past few decades, is that when you do find these rare examples, you can then use them as a means with which to interpret other sites with evidence for shells with pigment on, but those shells are not fossils, they're from food collection. It starts to allow you to sort of enrich your inferences for the broader aspects of what Neanderthals are up to. And another really good example is their apparent interest in birds. This is something that people have probably heard of. It's been in the headlines and things for a few years now. Or Neanderthals were collecting eagle talons or feathers, and some of the more recent reconstructions of Neanderthals, you see them with like feathers in their hair and stuff, and that's coming from these archaeological sort of sources. The issue with birds is again, there are functional reasons why you're going to be interested in birds. They have meat. And we can certainly see that Neanderthals were eating a wide diversity of bird species. They were going after game birds, but also raptors, birds of prey, and even tiny little birds like blackbirds we find butchered ones. So they are eating loads of different birds, but are they doing anything else with them as well? Are they using those birds as a resource for something else? And this is where the evidence gets very tricky, and it's about how you try to rule out other things. So one of the key sort of recent discoveries is that along with butchering the meat-bearing parts of the body, Neanderthals also seem to have been quite interested in bird wings. And in some cases, it looks as if, based on the cut marks that we find on the bones, that they were skinning the wings, taking off, the skin with all the feathers, or just taking those feathers off. Primary flight feathers, the big ones, they don't have thermal properties. They're not going to be, not going to be stuffing a sleeping bag with those. What are they for? Why would you go to that level of processing of a carcass? And in some places, in fact in Fumane, the same site, there's evidence that they were processing these different body parts, or at least leaving them in different parts of the cave. There's one area where there's just loads of bits of wings, so something is going on. With the feathers, we don't know what they're doing with that, but the other aspect is that there's also an interest in feet, and there's not a lot of meat on a bird's foot. You might make some stock with it, but through very careful, very clever analysis of the cut marks, it's possible to see some places where we can even rule out that they were interested in tendons, because in raptor claws, if you've ever seen an eagle foot, it's scary, and they have gigantic tendons, which allows them to hold on to their prey. And they can actually be very useful, in ethnographic contexts. There are definite cases where indigenous communities will use raptor tendons for different purposes. So that's one practical explanation. But if you look at where the cut marks are on some of these talons, you can see that they were just slicing through the talons, through the tendons rather. They're not interested in that. It's the actual talon that they're after. So, and at that point, if you start to say, oh well, it's a handy pointy thing, that starts to become special pleading, because they are surrounded by other pointy stuff they could use. They're perfectly capable of making stone pointy things all the time. They're also surrounded by extremely sharp bone splinters from their normal carcass processing. So I think at that point one has to say, okay, something else is happening. In most
one
of
has
the
to ask, what is it telling you?
Yeah, I mean, and
Sorry.
in terms of sort of finding these really interesting case studies that allow you to go beyond that,
Yeah.
until very recently, we just had sites with bird talons and interesting. Then there was a site, or rather there is a site that's actually a 19th century excavation. So the context is not brilliant, but there are a number of eagle talons from that site. They were analysed and some of them were found to have little polish facets on them as if they had rubbed against something else hard. It was proposed that maybe those were parts of a necklace. For me, I don't think that's well supported because we don't know if those talons were actually ever associated with each other in a layer. It's not a great context. Unlike really cool work in southern Africa where there's lots of shells that were found in a small area, they had lovely polish facets and you can actually experimentally reconstruct how those tiny bits of polish formed because they were strung in a particular way. So that's fantastic. We don't have that for the claws.
No.
But what we do have is just recently, one of the claws from that site has had analysis underneath a mineral film on it. There is pigment, and more than that, it's a pigment mix of two different kinds of pigment with a bit of charcoal, I think, and some clay. So once you have two substances that are unusual, that do not have a functional sort of aspect together, just like with the fossil shell and the pigment in Italy, then you will be able to look at the other sites where you only have talons and think, okay, maybe there really is something going on here and we're just, only seeing the surface of that. So it's that level of sort of detective work that you have to go to with Neanderthals before you can be confident in saying, okay, there probably is something aesthetic, perhaps socially meaningful, going on with bird talons in different places. So it takes this extent of complex argument to be able to support claims for some kind of aesthetic sense, but I do think it's there.
And as you say, in a way which isn't required when you come across, coloured stuff in a Homo sapiens perspective or context. So. And to be honest, I'm not. I mean, I don't know if you have any conclusions about that, but maybe it's not. Maybe the beautiful thing here is actually to simply be able to lay out that evidence and say this is what we find.
Yeah.
Because I guess if you want, it would be somewhat crass to go down a literal sort of it's for costumes or it's for art or it's for but these sorts of questions are, I guess, what's going to set up a future answer or a future notion about this sort of stuff.
Yeah, I mean, we don't know what those claws were for. Polish can form in different ways, but I think what we can say, certainly about the fossil shell with the red pigment from Formane,
Oh, and also, sorry, just to be clear, that stuff hasn't just come together by accident. Because of those different sources.
No, there's no pigment in that cave. That fossil shell has been picked up. A Neanderthal has been presumably walking about. We know they're interested in stone as a resource massively. So for me, and Neanderthal having geological curiosity is not surprising. Presumably, they come across this geological deposit in the landscape, investigate it, notice that there are fossil shells. They may have been from a community that were operating at a wide enough range that they knew what the seashore was like, that they were familiar with the sea and seafood as a resource, and that may have been something that's curious for them as people, who have no means to transport tons of stuff around the landscape with them. Even though it's small, it's a choice to have carried that. And then you add the pigment, which itself is sourced from 40 kilometers away from the cave somewhere else. At that, it's only on the outside of the shell, not the inside. The shell itself also, microscopic analysis, it's got a little hole on the outside, but the there are indications that there's a little bit of polish on sort of the mouth of the shell and on this other side of the hole. So the researchers suggested perhaps it had been threaded or strung or something like that. But it appears to have been something important enough to have been kept, handled, had pigment applied. Was it lost?
Yeah.
You don't know. It's very small. Could have just been lost. You can't really go much beyond that, except you can say, well, as a species who are totally familiar with using material objects in their daily lives all the time, and as a very social species, which we would expect Neanderthals to be, with complex emotional relationships within that group, would it be surprising if they were using materials as part of those relationships, as a means of building or maintaining relationships, just as we see chimpanzees do? They play, they give each other bits, they have an interest in materials, not the same way as we do, but Neanderthals I would expect to be closer to the kind of thing that we're doing. So perhaps it's an object that's meaningful. Is it a gift? Is it something you make for a child? I don't know, but something is going on.
And I suppose it's one of the first things that anthropologists, I think, examine, because it's such an interesting case study, are things like, for example, the potlatch. This notion that actually just the basic gathering of materials is important for us, and in that instance, the ceremonial destruction of excess is important. And so, any gathering of material is itself an additive
Yes, it's an
process.
accumulation.
It's accumulation, yeah, exactly. And therefore it's bound to have, also, it's likely to have some sort of social impact if someone accumulates, as you say, things from different places, brings them
Different
together.
substances, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
And we know as well, I mean, from the Crapina site with that talon where there's this pigment mix, there is another site, a Spanish site, where you have shells which are probably from food waste, but they have a pigment mix on them as well. And in that case, it's got iron pyrite in, which has real aesthetic visual potential. It's shiny, it's fool's gold, basically. So they are interested in mixing things. And then there's this whole other realm where you start to need to connect different aspects of what Neanderthals were doing, aesthetics with technology, when you get composite tools. So, tools made of multiple parts where you have a handle, an adhesive, and then a stone, or just an adhesive handle, in fact. That's interesting in itself. That has massive cognitive implications in itself. It's this idea of bringing different products together to make something new.
Comfort.
That was sourced from sourced from different places in the land. But in an Italian site, just recently found again, we find an adhesive which is a mix of pine resin and beeswax. So that's another case where they are creating an additive substance. They are experimenting with material properties. And although presumably that's not a visual aesthetic experience, the smell of beeswax and pine resin, the Neanderthals lived in a multi-sensory world just as we do. And we sort of often, as I was talking about with aesthetics and the idea of art being a finished thing, well, music is an experience. You listen to it in the moment, but also smells is so important to us, and we forget that, really. But when you think about it, smell has massive potential to trigger memory, things like this. So there's no reason why Neanderthal aesthetics had to purely be about visual things either. And the more you do this, sort of writing the book, the more you start to see connections between different aspects of what they're doing, and the interest in materials and qualities of materials is there throughout all the different things they do in their lives, including stoneworking, also hunting. They're hyper aware of different species, of the different body parts in an animal. So there's this commonality that you start to see across different sort of realms of what they were doing.
Well, and it's interesting, is it not, that more or less everything you've described there is the sort of behaviour that I would describe to a primary school class when it comes to upper Paleolithic behaviour from our ancestors in Europe. It's not. It shouldn't be well, I would humbly submit it shouldn't be that controversial to suggest that these human-like creatures were very human-like. It's
Yes.
interesting. I suppose just very briefly, just conscious of your time this morning, but just two final questions. First of all, how did we get there? How did we get to the point where these creatures have had to, these other humans have had to have such stringent advocates in order to replace their abilities, their cognizance, their humanity? Do you think this is purely an idea of being suddenly exposed to this other and then having to reconcile it with previous, for example, religious beliefs, or do you think there's something a bit more fundamental about about suddenly seeing something that wasn't previously known about?
I think it's two things. I think clearly, the older you get in time, the more challenging archaeology is.
Mm.
And, what 19th century prehistorians could even dream would be possible from a site, what you can get out of it.
Mm.
They would have had no idea of what we can do now.
Mm.
So the ability to say things that I say in that book is because of 160 years of developments in archaeology. So that's one aspect. But definitely there's a clear sort of bias in wishing to position Neanderthals as other, and it emerges from a very obvious racist 19th century worldview, where people living hunter-gatherer lives had been encountered for 2-3 centuries and roundly dismissed as savage, as in animal-like.
Yes.
And they were the 19th century, the Neanderthals emerged right in the middle of people merrily creating, tiered classifications of living peoples, and saying,
into zoos, in fact.
These people are more primitive. They literally branched off before white people did, so they're more primitive, or they're more to do with orangutans, whatever. That was not just an intellectual pursuit. That was being used to justify not only initially sort of slavery, but when that was the legal conditions were changed for that, it was just replaced by colonial rule and oppression of
the subject races.
Exactly. And it's no coincidence that that the Aboriginal peoples were most often used as comparisons with some of the early Neanderthal fossils, because they were deemed to be the lowest of the low, because they were hunter-gatherers and they had very dark skin and all of these reasons. And people were so blinded by that some of the early scholars were happy to dismiss aspects of the anatomy that didn't support that. So I think that understanding of Neanderthals as being expected, although nobody expected the Neanderthals, in some ways they were surprised, but once...
That's the title for your next book. Nobody expected the Neanderthals.
Yeah. Once we sort of got our heads around their existence, they were immediately used to, or fitted in to this notion of superior kinds of humans and lesser kinds of humans. We were quite happy to do that. Whereas, the question is interesting, and I do talk about it in the last chapter of the book. Why was it not the case that Neanderthals, as another kind of an ancient form of human, why did that not stimulate people to see all of living people as a unified thing? Why did that not have the opposite effect? Well, because the people who are in charge in those sort of the upper levels of the intelligentsia, if you want to call it that, that's not really appropriate, but they didn't want to see that. I'm not, some of this is unconscious, of course, but archaeologists in the late 19th century were quite happily providing skull measurements from Egypt to feed into very early eugenicist ideas. So that link is very clear. and Neanderthals are part of that.
Mm.
And when some of the early Neanderthals in the early 20th century were being found, some of the more complete remains, there's accounts of them sort of people saying, well, could they smile? Because, we know black people have lesser range of facial expressions than white people, and so it's not that there wasn't this intermeshing. There really was.
Yeah, and actually it's funny enough. Growing up, I remember reading in high school. I don't know what book I was reading, but I was reading something where it was pointed out that at one point, for example, people in Wales were having their heads measured for
Oh
precisely the
God,
same
not
reasons.
surprised, yeah.
Yeah. It's like, oh, you people out in the wilds of so and so, you must be lesser people. On that note, then, you mentioned before we started recording that towards the end of your book, in comes industrialization and mining and things like that. What on earth is the Industrial Revolution doing in a book about Neanderthals?
Well, it's a weird thing because there's this interesting question of what are we ready to find? Why did we find Neanderthals, or why did we realize what Neanderthals were in the 19th century? And geology had been sort of coming to terms with the horrible age of the earth for 100 years or so. Ideas about evolution were coalescing, and there had been early sort of primate fossils found. But the engine for some of these early discoveries was not people enthusiasts going and scratching around in caves, although that was happening. It was also the expanded sort of fragmentation of the landscape itself through quarrying. The first Neanderthal that was recognized, the Neanderthal discovery from Feldhofer cave in Germany, that was uncovered because of gigantic quarrying that was going on to feed industrial demand for limestone and marble and things like this. And then you have other cases where railways were being built and things were found, and in Gibraltar, which was a skull that was actually found before the Feldhofer one, but it wasn't recognized. That was only discovered because the British were there quarrying to build military stuff, and the officers who were more educated and interested in natural history had a little scientific society, and presumably a quarry person spotted that and found it. But that's also the interesting question. We know the names of some of the people slightly further up the food chain, but not always the names of the people whose hands first found these. We don't know the name of the quarry person in Gibraltar or in Germany. So that's kind of interesting. Why, although there are some hints that people didn't always know what they found. For example, in the German case, the quarry workers were basically blasting out this cave, the Feldhofer cave, that was full of clay, and they were used to finding big bones, animal bones. But it was the quarry overseer, whose name we do know actually, who realised that they weren't bare bones. So I'm interested, how did he know that? Was he a member of this local natural history society who he contacted, and then it was passed on to this guy that was in charge of the Natural History Society, and then he passed it to the anatomist in Bonn. But that, for that quarryman, his personal interest, he had enough knowledge to recognize that this wasn't bare. So there's all these different strands in terms of the 19th century context and the different social contexts within which things are found. But we can certainly be sure people did find Neanderthal fossils in the deep past. Just don't know about it. So,
well, and it is interesting, isn't it, in that sense that at a time when there was, as you say, this very big push to fragment the landscape, to expand outwards on rail, to so on and so forth, we suddenly were discovering new things about our past and our ancestors and our shared ancestry with other humans, but also the very fact that it's rooted in this notion of there being a tiered humanity is fascinating. And as you say, the fact that the discoverers weren't necessarily the people who who got credit. Isn't that kind of the story of Neanderthals? They just haven't necessarily had the credit that they deserve for as long as we've known them. Where do you see Neanderthals, as it were, going in the future? Do you think eventually we'll get to a point where Neanderthal isn't a byword for for someone who was a thuggish, brutish person?
I don't know, because it doesn't show much signs of disappearing, I have to say.
No.
It would be nice to think that that this book might might change people's minds. I hope it does, but no, I don't know. I think people are going to be willing to use that as a sort of an insult for some time to come. I think also they're referring in some ways to past understanding of Neanderthals, because I think most people, or certainly people I come across who are not archaeologists, they do have some understanding of some modern ideas about Neanderthals. They'll say, "Oh yeah, they weren't as stupid as we used to think, were they?" Or "Oh, I've heard that they did things with their dead," and so those ideas do filter in. But yeah, I think the notion of a Neanderthal perhaps is now actually sort of a symbolic idea. I don't think people necessarily, if they stopped and thought about it, would associate that with some of the modern ideas about Neanderthals.
No. Okay, so there's the idea, and then there's the
reality.
Okay, cool. Well, we are going to draw this to a close. One final question for you: if you could tell people anything about Neanderthals, any interesting Neanderthal idea or tidbit or thing that you particularly personally love, what would it be? What do you want people to know that they don't currently know?
I guess aside from all the really cool things I've already talked about, I would say that what I love is upending the idea of Neanderthals as creatures of the ice. They've had this sort of frozen world behind them in people's minds for so long, but they lived in oak forests. They walked around under dappled leaves. They heard woodpeckers, and they were creatures of interglacials just as much as we are. And so I think the Neanderthals can feel quite distant sometimes, but that sort of current world that we're in is really in environmental terms not so different. And thinking about how that the Neanderthals of the forest, that is a completely different idea, and how we have evidence that they may well have had to change how they lived, which makes sense to live in a forest. But I think that's what I would like people to take away, that they didn't really like hyper Arctic, super cold conditions. They liked grasslands and they could deal with that. But yeah, woodland Neanderthals, sunny times, eating tortoises on the Mediterranean coast.
I once heard a description that a tortoise to a Neanderthal was like a boil in the bag supper.
I like it.
So horrible, isn't it? So horrible, but also so completely relatable. I just feel, I always just imagine this sort of, oh no, this tortoise and then just being carried away. Thank you so much for your time this morning.
Thank you.
It's been a pleasure. And if anyone below has any particular questions or comments, please do type them out, and either I'll pass them on, or who knows, maybe Rebecca will take a look at them and answer them herself in written form. But it's been good, and I suppose if there is another book, or there is something else exciting or something like that.
Oh, there is a book too. I started writing it today.
Yeah. Well, there you go. There's your title. No one expected the Neanderthal. But no, thank you very much, and also I'd love to obviously check in with you in the future if that's okay as well.
Yeah, great.
Well, until next time. Do take care, everyone at home.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Bye.